Hello everyone, welcome to today's workshop. Today we'll be going over an introduction to Java, the programming language. We'll be going over the basic fundamentals of Java. I am your host today, Shaleen, the workshop manager here at ACM at Cal State Fullerton. So let's just dive right into it. So some table of contents we're going to go over. Obviously, we're going to go over like the main idea of what Java is, and then we'll go over some examples of softwares or projects that people have done using Java. Then we'll go over some key concepts of Java, like variables, methods, arrays, and all that kind of stuff. And then at the end of it, I'm gonna be doing a demo of a tic-tac-toe game using BlueJ, which is like a text editor that's mainly focused on working with Java. So what is Java? Well, Java is a class-based object-oriented programming language. That's designed to have a few implementation dependencies as possible. It was founded on May 23rd of 1995, and it was designed by James Gosling. And since its release, it's made a big impact in the computer world and like just computer science in general, as Java has kind of just revolutionized just how technology and how the computer works today. So some examples of Java. First of all, Minecraft. Minecraft was programmed in Java. If you didn't know, if you notice, if you're to open up Minecraft on your PC or Mac or just like on your computer, the first thing you would notice is that the title says Minecraft Java Edition. That's because the creator of Minecraft, Marcus Notch Pearson, you might have heard of him as Notch. He was the one who developed it. He programmed the entire game in Java, and that's kind of like one of the major Java projects that exist today. So yeah, Minecraft is definitely one of the major projects or examples of Java. Another one is Android applications. If you worked with Android Studio, or you can program those apps in two languages. One is Kotlin, which is not very it's not really used anymore, but then there's also an option to write it in Java, which is more popular, a little bit easier to write code in. So most Android apps through Android Studio are developed in Java. And another one that not really people know of is YouTube. YouTube is kind of one like the backend services used for YouTube. I think along with C++, Java is one of the languages used to run youtube.com. So here's kind of like an outline of the Java package in general. So if you notice, so there's the Java package, then there's the language, utility, and AWT sub packages. And in each of these, there's a system string array list. That might sound a little bit different because if you've worked with languages like C++, that might sound a little bit confusing, but we'll go over array list later in this workshop. Then there's the map and button class. That's kind of this is kind of like an outline of how the Java system works. And it's used to create many different programs. So so people tend to ask like, so what's the difference between Java and C++? Java tends to be more for object-oriented programming. Like I've done a lot of projects in Java, create like a Super Mario Brothers game, but if I were to do that in C++, it'd take way too much time. And then like when you compile Java, it takes like a slower runtime. And in Java, there's this thing called method overloading, where instead of function overloading, like you've heard in C++, it's instead of that you do method overloading. And then in Java, there's this thing called garbage collection system, where the variables or functions that are not used anymore, they're just automatically deleted from the program when you compile it. And with C++, and Java tends to be a little bit more complicated to learn from my experience. And so with C++, if you're a beginner in programming, it's a little bit easier to learn when you're a beginner. And, when you get the idea, basic fundamental programming, then, I would suggest to look at other languages. So like Python or Java or C Sharp. You could definitely look into that. But you should know the basics first. And then with C++, usually has like a faster runtime, has function overloading, and then it's not very object-oriented friendly. You could use object-oriented programming for C++, but do keep in mind that it takes a lot of work and a lot of lines of code, to do object-oriented programming. So now we'll be going over some variables, methods, and some extra features that are included in the Java package. So some variables you guys might be familiar with. So there's integers or ints. So that's like real numbers. So 0, 1, 2, 3, up to 1,000 or infinity, pretty much. The double variable, that's kind of like used for decimals. So 0 0.1, 1.2, 2.5, that kind of thing. Floats are kind of like the same thing as double. And then string is kind of like a list of characters in one word type of thing. So like an example of a string would be hello or teacher, that kind of thing. Char is also known as character, which is it's like the alphabet. So an example of char would be A. So with the difference between string and char is that string is like a collection of characters into one word. Char or characters is like a single alphabet. So A, B, C, D, all the way to Z. And Boolean is a variable that is used for determining if a function is true or false. So for example, if you were to create a like a guessing game, so you could say that the user could input like the program say, oh, I'm going to guess a number between 1 through 10, and so in that function, like whatever the user inputs, you can create like a Boolean function that will check if the user input is like what the computer said the number was, that the number it guessed, and if it's not, then it would return false. But if it is, it would return true. So Boolean is kind of like a true and false variable to check different things. So methods, if you're familiar with C++, it's functions, but in Java, it's known by methods, and it's kind of like a block of code, which it's usually when it's only run when it's called. You can pass data members, others known as parameters, into a method. They're usually used to perform certain actions, and if you work with C++, they're functions. Methods is just how it's defined in Java. So like an example could be public integer function, and then have two integer variables passed into the parameters. Public is like a keyword in Java used to run programs. So arrays you guys might have been familiar with. If not, so an array is, used to store a collection of data, whatever variable it is, strings, characters, integers, doubles, floats, all that stuff. And it's often more useful to think of an array as a collection of variables of the same type. So you can't create an array that's an integer and a string. That would not work. So usually it's like one formatted array. So some examples could be, there are two ways of writing an array. So one is an integer, and then the brackets indicate that's in an array, and you're initializing it. So int bracket array1, the variable name of the array, is equal to bracket, and then the 3 is inside. That indicates that the size of the array is size 3. Or another way you could write it as integer bracket array, variable name array1, and then you could have the amount, like the values stored into it beforehand. So you would have like the curly brackets, and then you could put in values such as 1, 2, and 3, so that like you don't have to so like if you're to initialize like this int array 1 equals to bracket 3, you wouldn't have to later on add values to it before. You could just do it beforehand, but both ways work perfectly fine. And like a real world example I like to think of when using arrays is like a box of cookies, because you're just like storing cookies in like a box. That's how like I would think of an array as. So 2D arrays or two-dimensional arrays, it's kind of like think of it like a table, um, a row and column table. So it's also known as an array of arrays. It's in Java, it's known as like data stored in rows and columns, and you can access it, using both row and column index. So some examples, like two ways you could initialize it is, so like I mentioned before, when you initialize like a one-dimensional array, you just have one bracket, but if you're initializing a two-dimensional array, you need two of those and have the variable name. And then instead of having one bracket, you would have two. So the 3 variable here, let me pull out my, let me see if I could pull up the pointer. Okay, that's fine. We don't have to. So, oops. Okay. My bad. So the variable 3 here is the row. So like row, row, row. And then the value 4 is the amount of columns. So 3 rows and 4 columns for a table. Another way you could write, so think of the first bracket as the row, and then think of the second bracket as the amount of columns, size of it. And then another way you could initialize it, like I mentioned before, you could have values stored into it beforehand. Same initialization, and then equals to the amount of values you put in there. So 1, 2, 3, comma, and then 4, 5, 6. So so for row 1, it'd be 1, 2, 3. And then for the second row, it'd be 4, 5, 6 kind of deal. And like I mentioned before, it's like a table with rows and columns. And what you would use is a nested for loop. It's kind of like a for loop within a for loop. We'll go over more of that in more detail later on. But that is kind of used when you're traversing through a 2D array. Okay, so like I mentioned before in the diagram for the Java package, array list. If you work with C++, you might not be familiar with it, as array list isn't really used in C++, but it's kind of like a resizable array. It has like a fixed size. You can change the size dynamically compared to like a normal array. Variables or elements inside the array list can be added or removed whenever there's a need, and it's more memory easy. It's easier with memory. It's friendly. It's memory friendly. That's what I was trying to say. And the way you would initialize it is array list, like the full name, and then the variable type. So it can be integer, double, string, char, whatever is in those brackets. And then have the variable name in it. So in this case, it'd be array1. And then have the new keyword in there. So that means you're initializing a new array list, and the variable type, and then parentheses to initialize an array list, like a new array list. And like a real world example I thought of when working with array lists, it's kind of like creating an employee class with specific values storing into array list. So it's like their name, date of birth, position, age, type of thing, those kind of stuff. And so we're going to go over some loops. So most of you might have heard of a for loop, and it's kind of like a repetition loop that allows you to, efficiently, write a loop that needs to be executed, a number amount of times. And it's it's useful when you know how many times a task has to be completed. Um, so like an example for loop, so you could write for integer I, so you're initializing at value 0, and I is less than 5, then it's going to increment each time. You could print out hello world, and it would print out 4 times, because um, since you want to run it at less than 5 times, it's going to go through 4 times, and then it's going to stop there. So it'll print out hello world 4 times. A for each loop, you guys might have heard of it in C++, or whatever language you guys are in. But in Java, a for each loop is kind of like a control flow statement. When traversing through, traversing items in a collection, it's pretty much used in place of a standard for loop statement. And while loop, you guys might have heard of. It's kind of like a Boolean type condition or Boolean type loop. So it's like a statement that allows code to be executed repeated on a given Boolean condition. And it can be thought of it as a repeating if statement. Instead of writing multiple if statements, if you have like a while loop, and it'll execute that many times based on the given condition. All right, so now it's time for our demo of the tic-tac-toe game, and we'll be using BlueJ to kind of demonstrate through that. So yeah, let's just get right into it. All right, so here we are on BlueJ, the text editor for Java mainly. So here we have 3 implemented classes that will help us create the main function for this game. So let's go over the functions that will help us create the main file, or the main function, sorry. So we have the import Java utility scanner, which is a feature in the Java package, which allows the user of the program to input whatever the variable type is. So an integer, string, character, whatever it is, a Boolean. So that's what that does. So let's take a look at the functions that will help us create the public static void main string file. So this function here, the Jawboard function, what this does is pretty much draws out the tic-tac-toe board for the game. So first of all, when this function is called, it's going to print out board first, so that the user knows what this is, and then it goes through a nested for loop that prints out the board. And if you guys remember when I mentioned about 2D arrays, when you work with 2D arrays, you usually want to use a nested for loop to iterate through each element in the table in this case. So in the nested for loop, in the inner for loop, it will print out the board. And then for the sake of neatness and stuff, this system.out.println function will just leave a gap so that it looks more clear. So the next function is the public static char player has 1 function, which is passing through a 2D array. So what this function does is that it checks if someone has 1 and then return the winning player. So these 2 for loops here, it'll iterate through the table, and then it will check. So like for here, we're checking the row columns, or sorry, the rows. So we check each row to see if any of them are blank, and if they're not, then it'll return the board at that certain position, and then here it'll check each column to see if any player has 1. And then since in tic-tac-toe we have a diagonal way of winning, so we can check those by going through each spot in the table to see if they're not empty, and then return the certain position. Otherwise, if no one has 1 yet, it'll return blank. Now let's take a look at the public static Boolean board is full function that passes in a 2D array, a char 2D array. So we have a nested for loop which iterates through the table, In this case, it's named this I is row, J is column, and then the if statement will check if if any of these if any spot in the array or in the table is blank, then it is false. So this function is pretty much just checking if the board is full or not. And so this if statement is pretty much checking if the board is full, and if it isn't, then return false and continue on. Otherwise, if it doesn't apply, then it returns true, and then that's that. Okay, so now we know what these three functions do. Now let's create the main function. So let's come down here and let's like the three functions, we're gonna say public static, but this time we're gonna say it's a void, and then we'll call it main, and then pass in the string args. And this is kind of like the typical way to start a Java program. So if you were to create a Java file, this is usually the best way to start. Okay, so knowing we have these three functions here, let's create the main function. So the first thing I would want to do is we need a board. We need to create a board, tic-tac-toe board. So what we're going to do is I'm going to comment this out first. I'm going to put some comments, and writing down comments is a huge thing when it comes to programming and computer science, so that like whoever reads your code can understand better what you're trying to do. So we're going to create a 3x3 array for a tic-tac-toe game, which represents our tic-tac-toe board. Okay. So in tic-tac-toe, since we have each two players, their variable is marked as X or O, right? So what we're gonna do is we're gonna use a char variable, a char 2D array. You could also use a string, but since we're only using one alphabet, it's better to use a char for this. And then we'll name it board. We'll set that equal to new. Char to initialize a new 2D array. And make it 3x3. Okay, and now what we want to do is we want to fill in our 2D board, the tic-tac-toe board, with dashes or like the empty positions of the for the game. So players know when they play this that those spots are available to take. So let's type that out. So we're going to initialize our game board with dashes, otherwise known as empty positions. All right. So like I mentioned before, when you work with 2D arrays, you want to use a nested for loop, which is pretty much a for loop within a for loop. So say for, let's say int row, since we're kind of working with rows and columns, right? Row is less than 3. And row will increment by 1 each time we go through this. And so we'll do another for loop for integer column call for columns. We'll initialize that to 0. And while that is less than 3, we're going to increment that by 1. And now we want to print the dashes at each spot in the board. So we are going to get the board at spot row, spot column, do those list, and we'll set that to dash. So when it iterates through, each index in the row and column will be filled with dashes. So let's do that. And that's the end of the for loop. So now we have initialized our board. now what we want to do is create a scanner or like the input and make sure the computer asks the players for their names. So we're going to create a scanner and ask the players for their names. So the way you would initialize a scanner in Java so you have the word scanner and then have a variable name. So we'll say in for input, and we'll say that it's a new scanner. We're initializing a new scanner. And then the way you would initialize it is using system.in, taking in the variable name. Okay, and in Java, we use system.out.print or print line to print out stuff, right? In C++, people might be in C++, it's known as cout, like cout dash dash, but in Java, it's considered to be system.out.print or print line. So we're gonna have the computer say, let's play tic-tac-toe. Okay, and make sure to have parentheses. So like in C++, you would have the command line. So the comments, so like that. Okay, and then make sure to have brackets, otherwise you're gonna get error and semicolon. And then we'll have it print out. We're gonna print. So the difference between print line and print is that print line, what every time you write it out, it's gonna print on each new line. But if you do system.out.print, it's gonna print on that one line. So we'll say player 1. What is your name? Like that. And so we are going to initialize a player 1 input string. So we'll say string p1 for player 1 is equal to in. Remember, in was right here for our scanner. In dot next line. And so what I pretty much did here is I initialized a string input for the user. So when it comes to that part, the user will input a string, or in this case, their name. And this is the format in Java where you would use it to initialize a string input. So for string, it'd be next line, but like, if it was an integer, it would be in dot next int, like that. But in this case, we're using string. So after player 1 puts their name in, we'll ask player 2 to put their name in. Player 2, what is your name? And what we did for P1, we'll do the same thing for player 2. So we'll do string P2 equal in dot next line. And so player 2 will input their name in. So that's done with. So now, next step we want to do is, what we want to do is create a player 1 Boolean set to true if it's player's 1 turn, and false if it's player's 2 turn. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a Boolean variable called player 1. And we're going to set that equal to true So we'll say to create a player1 Boolean set to true if it's player one's turn, and is false if it is player two's turn. So if it's not player one's turn, then this variable will be set to false. Okay, now the next thing we want to do is create a Boolean function called like a Boolean function that is used in to check if the game is ended or not. So we're going to create a Boolean function called game ended, and we'll set that to false. Mainly for the fact that the game's not going to end as soon as the program starts, unless if we run into some compiling errors. But I assume that shouldn't happen, so we'll set that to false right away. And then let's use a while loop for this. So while game ended is not, let's say while game ended is not false, or in this case it's true, hypothetically, we'll have the drawboard. We'll use the drawboard function here. We are going to call that function here. So we'll say drawboard, pass in the 2D array, because remember, drawboard is passing in a 2D char array. And in this main function, we create a new char 2D array. So we'll pass in board. Okay, and now let's do this. So the while loop is, let's exit the while loop. No, sorry, we don't exit the while loop yet. So now what we want to do is print out, we want the computer to print out whose turn it is. So we'll be using an if statement, and we'll be using the Boolean player1 variable that's set to true. So if player one is true, then we'll have it print out system.out.print line the player one's input, and then we'll say it's player's one turn and X, because remember X and O are the variables used in tic-tac-toe. And then else, if that's not true, then it's player's two turn. System.out.print line player two, or in this case P2, because remember P2 is the player two initialize input. I'll say it's player two's turn, and their variable is O. Like that. Okay. All right, moving on. Now what we want to do is create a character variable or a char value that stores either the X variable or the O variable, depending on whose turn it is, if it's player one or player two's turn. So creating a char variable that will store either X or O, depending on whose turn it is, and we'll say player one or player two. So let's create a char variable. We'll call char C, and we'll set that equal to the dashed line from the board. And let's do an if statement, and we'll use the Boolean function. So if it's player's one turn, we'll set the char variable c equal to x. Else, we'll say else if it's player's two turn, we'll set that variable equal to o. Okay. Now, so now what we want to do is we want to create a row and column variables, which both represent the indexes that correspond to the position on the game board. So we're going to create two integer values. We'll call it int row, and we'll set that equal to 0. Same thing with column. We'll say int col equal to 0. And now we're going to create a while loop, once the user enters a valid position. So if you guys are familiar with arrays, you know that an array index starts at 0. It doesn't start at 1. That's just how arrays work. So, spot 1 is spot 0 in this case. 0, 1, 2, 3, all the way there. That's how arrays work. We'll say while true, while this is true. And then what we want to do is we want to ask the user for what positions they want to place their x or o variables at. So ask the user for what position they want to place their x or o. So we're gonna have to program print out enter a row number, not row number, and we'll say it's from 0, 1, or 2, because remember in arrays that's the syntax. And then what we'll do is we'll set the row variable, and we'll set that value to the input. And then next, and remember when I talked about how next line was for strings, and I mentioned that the next int was for integers. So the user will now input a integer value between 0, 1, and 2. And then we'll have the program also print out enter a column number, and we'll say same thing, 0, 1, or 2. Like that. Fix that, like that. And then we'll set that column integer value equal to the input dot next int. And so the user will input a value between 0 and 2 for row and column. Now we want to check if the user input is actually between 0, 1, and 2, because if a user inputs 3, then that's not how it works, because in arrays it's 0, 1, 2, and it's a 3 by 3 board. So 3 in this case would be like index 4. Okay, so we want to check if the row and column, let's say column in this case, are 0, 1, or 2. Best way to check this is using an if statement. So we'll do if row is less than 0, or that's the or variable, or column is less than 0, or row is greater than 2, or column is greater than 2. Then we want the program to print out that it's out of bounds, basically. So say system.out.println. This position is off the bounds of the board. And we'll say try again. And so the user will input another value. Else, well, let's do an else if statement. So else if, we'll do else if statement. So we'll say, let's check if the position on the board that the user entered is empty or not, right? So we basically want to check if someone has already made a move there. So we'll say else if the board at spot, row, and column is not equal to the dashed line or empty, then we want the program to print out that that a player has already taken this spot and you have to go somewhere else. So say someone has already made a move at this position. Let's do that, and we'll say try again. All right, and let's do another else statement. And in this else statement, we want to see if both those if statements do not work, or like they don't match, then just break out the while loop and continuing on. So say else break. Okay. Moving on, and now let's exit the while loop. All right. So now what we want to do is set the position on the board at the index row and column to variable C, which is the dash line. So say board at row and column is equal to C. So what we're doing here is we're setting the position on the board at row and col to C. And we'll write the dash line for clarification. Now we want to check if a player has won. That's the main part. So in this case, we're going to be using the Boolean function, or the char variable player has won, which takes in arguments of a 2D array. Let's go down here. So we are going to create an if statement. So let's comment this out first. We are going to see if a player has won the game. Let's create an if statement. So we'll call the player has won function, and we'll pass in the 2D array or the board. And if it's equal to the character X, that means player one has won. So the program will print out the input name and has won. And remember that game ended Boolean variable that was over here? We set that equal to false. Now that is equal to true. So we're going to change the value of that because since player one has won, game's over, right? So we're going to make that Boolean variable equal to true. Let's create an else if statement to see if player two has won. So if player has won, we pass in the board. And if that variable is equal to O, then we have the program printouts that player 2 has won. So say, okay, so we have the name input for player 2, and we'll say has won. Like that. And then we'll do the same thing that we did in the if statement. We'll set that game ended Boolean variable to true this time. But in tic-tac-toe, there's always a case where the entire board is filled up and there is no winner. It's a tie. So we're going to create an else statement for that. So we'll say if neither player has won, check to see if there has been a tie. Or like, in other words, if the board is full. So we'll say if, and then this time, now we're going to be calling the board is full function right here. We're going to be using this function now. So we'll say if board is full, and we'll pass in board. Then we want to have the computer print out that it's a tie. It's a tie. And then we'll just have the game ended variable equal to true. And let's create an else statement. So we'll, that player 1 variable that we used. And so if player 1 is true, we want to make it false and vice versa that way. Because that way, then the players alternate each turn. So we'll do an else. And we'll have the player 1 variable. And then we'll equal the negation of player 1 so that it doesn't go to an infinite loop. That and that. Now, last thing we want to do is draw the board at the end of the game. So then we'll call the Jawboard function and we'll pass in board. And that is tic-tac-toe. So we have just written down the main function to this, given 3 functions that pass in 2D array chart, like a chart 2D array. So using these 3 functions, we have created a main function which initializes the board of the game, and then we pretty much create the game from there. So now all we have to do is click compile. As you can see, it says class compiled, no syntax errors. So now what we want to do is run it and try the demo. So now what we're going to do is go on the file and then right click this, and you'll see different ways of running it, but we want to run the main file. Click that, and then here we are. There we go. Let's play tic-tac-toe. Player 1, what is your name? I'll put my name in Shaleen. Player 2, what is your name? We'll say it's John. Okay, so now it fills out the board and it's my turn. Enter a row number 0, 1, or 2. So I want to go for the leftmost position, 0 and 0. Now it's John's turn. So I want to go diagonal. So let's say John goes at row 1 and here we go, it's column 0. And I want to go row 1 and column 1. Now John is trapped. He can't go anywhere. So he would go row 2, column 0. Oh, look. I have a clear shot for a win. So we're going to go 2 and column 2. Boom. Shaleen has won. And it shows the board at the end of it showing that I have won the game with the diagonal. And the game has ended. So that's the demo for tic-tac-toe. I hope you guys enjoyed it. You guys will have a lot of fun with this game. I think tic-tac-toe in Java is the best way to get started with Java. Best way to get the idea of what it is. So hopefully you guys enjoyed it. Thank you for joining us for this Java workshop. I hope you guys enjoyed the demo that we did for tic-tac-toe. Yeah, I hope you guys learned something new with Java. Yeah, thank you for watching. Make sure to subscribe to our ACM YouTube channel and give it a thumbs up. And if you have any comments or any questions or concerns, feel free to put in the chat and we'd be more than happy to help you guys out. And connect with ACM. So we have a Discord server where we will keep you guys up to date, and you can join the ACM community and talk about literally anything, whether it's tech related or not. There's the link right there. It's a bit.ly link, so /HCMCSUF. The QR code here on the right bottom right corner is a QR code that scans the Discord server. So you guys can go scan from there. And do follow us on social media, both on Instagram and Twitter, both with the same name at ACMCSUF. You guys can be kept up to date on upcoming events and a lot of other extra events coming up. So thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you guys at the next event. All right, bye-bye.